Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jackie Hefner, and I'm here from Pacific Northwest Publishing. We've got Jessica Sprick for our webinar today, Closing the Gaps, Creating a Continuum of Tier 2 and Tier 3 Behavior Support. Before we get started, I've got a couple quick details to review. You can submit questions along the way in the Q&A panel. We ask that you please send them to everyone instead of just the presenter, and then I can help Jess review them at the end of the session. If you run into technical trouble during the webinar, please send me a message during in the chat box as the host, and I will do what I can to help. The chat and the Q&A boxes can be a little tricky to find. If you're on a PC, if you look in the upper right corner of your window, there'll be the icons you can see on the left of the screen that kind of points to where we would find those windows. For Mac users, it's going to be on the lower right corner of the screen. I don't know why they set them in two different places, but we're trying to help make sure everybody knows where to go looking. One thing that we have found occasionally with the webinars is that you might have trouble with the audio broadcast if everybody or a bunch of people jump on a computer lab at your school all at once. If you run into trouble with the audio, we can send you instructions to call in by phone so that you can catch up with that. Please bear in mind that if you do run into any kind of technical troubles that we can't help you through, we are recording today's webinar and we will have it on our website in a couple days' time. We'll also send a link out later in the week so you know that it's available and ready to go. With all that said, I'm going to turn things over to Jessica because she's got a bunch of information for you today.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Sprick. I am with Safe and Civil Schools, and thank you all so much for attending today. It looks like we've got a good number of people who are here live, and I know that many people have signed up and may view the recording at a later time, so welcome to those of you that are watching it later as well. So our topic today is Closing the Gaps, Tier 2 and Tier 3 Behavioral Interventions. And one of the things that we've seen in our work at Safe and Civil Schools as we do work across the country with large and small districts in urban and suburban and rural environments is that there are some common pitfalls that we see sometimes when we're looking at multi-tiered systems of support and behavioral intervention. And so this session is really focused on trying to close some of those gaps that we see when we're working on behavioral interventions. Things like sometimes we see mentalities of people sort of taking on a "it's not my job" mentality. So whether it's classroom teachers thinking, you know, I can refer this problem to an outside interventionist and they're going to fix the problem outside of the classroom setting, or even if it's our whole school systems as a whole thinking, if we can just send this student somewhere else, it's going to be better for that child. And really recognizing the reality that we all have a shared part in this role of trying to provide effective supports for students, and the notion that really, except for a tiny minority of students, that our school systems are the best chances that they have to have a successful life and successful opportunities if we can provide them effective supports, whatever their level of need. One of the other gaps that we consistently see that we really want to start addressing is the issue that sometimes our interventionists in our schools, our school psychologists, our counselors, our behavioral interventionists, our social workers, end up with a big, long backlog of students that they're expected to intervene with simply because there are too many students being referred for intensive types of interventions that maybe could be solved in an earlier stage of the problem. So a big part of the focus today is how do we streamline our intervention systems, how do we ensure that we are preserving our most intensive resources for intervention for the students that truly need it. So really the idea being that we want to create a seamless continuum of behavior support that allows us to serve really every student that walks through our doors. So let me continue forward here. Our goals of our webinar today is that I'm going to try and frame this all within a multi-tiered system of identification as well as supports framework, and we're looking specifically at behavior, but this is going to really parallel a lot of your academic systems, and you'll see that there's a lot of connection and crossover. We also want to be talking on the second bullet about some of the differences between interventions at each tier and kind of what are the distinguishing features that separate Tier 1 from Tier 2 from Tier 3. The next piece here, identify a range of interventions for Tier 2 and Tier 3, is I'm going to be using some case examples to kind of demonstrate how we might filter students through these multi-tiered systems. I'll be providing some examples of some interventions and also providing some recommended resources and different things that we have available through Safe and Civil Schools, as well as through other types of service delivery and resources that are out there. And a big piece of what we wanted to accomplish today is Safe and Civil Schools has been delivering Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions for a long period of time, but we've now decided to put them together in a new cohort model of training. So for those of you who are familiar with Safe and Civil Schools model of Tier 1 positive behavioral interventions and supports through foundations, that's basically our Tier 1 PBIS model and the way that we train that, we're now going to be doing something very similar with Tier 2 and Tier 3 service delivery. So I'll be talking about kind of how we put that together and what that may look like if you're interested in talking with Safe and Civil Schools more about this cohort model of training for multiple schools within your district. For those of you who are on the live session today, you get the benefit because you're actually present today that I will be raffling 2 items at the end of the session, and we will be trying to get a random method to select 2 of the participants that are able to stay until the very end. So I will make it my goal to finish this right up at 2 o'clock Pacific time. I guess that would be 5 o'clock Eastern time. So if you're able to stay and join us, you have the possibility of earning some items. Just to make things manageable for what we're trying to accomplish today, the goals of today's webinar really are to focus more on the interventions themselves and what types of interventions can we put in place at Tiers 2 and 3. And with that notion, we realized that it was going to be a little bit too much to try and tackle in 1 hour to be talking in a lot of depth about the processes that go along with that identification procedure. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to make this webinar is the first of 2 in a 2-part series that the next webinar, which will probably occur in March or April of this year, is going to be focused more on the processes that go along with this multi-tiered model. So how do we really specifically identify students for Tiers 2 and 3? What are the types of teaming structures and who are the personnel that are involved with that, as well as what processes do we use to problem solve and make sure that we're efficiently and effectively using time wisely to identify what interventions are going to be helpful for each individual student. If that content is of significant interest for you right now, we do have a couple of resources currently available. One is Module F of Foundations, again, Foundations being Safe and Civil Schools model of Tier 1 positive behavioral intervention and support framework. And so Module F is focused on this continuum of behavior support and really going more into what are we doing at Tiers 2 and 3. And then we also have this resource, Behavioral Response to Intervention, creating a continuum of problem-solving support. And that's just one book, and it provides a really nice overview of kind of all of these problem-solving processes. Really with the idea this follow-up webinar and then these 2 resources are kind of the who is doing what, and when are they doing it. So again, we'll try and provide more of that depth of information at a later time. All right. Now, all of us know in education we have way too many acronyms going on, so I want to break down some of the ones that kind of guide this content. Some of you may have heard the terms MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, or RTI, response to intervention. Basically, different states have identified with one or the other of these, but most states are using some form of MTSS or RTI, basically with the notion that we are trying to provide layers of support that allow us to target students with different levels of need, with different levels of support. And with both MTSS and RTI, we find that there's academic and behavioral components to this, and in many school systems, they kind of separate those out. For PBIS, the third bullet there, positive behavioral interventions and supports, that is basically the behavioral side of MTSS or RTI. So you find that many schools are using PBIS, and it layers in very nicely with those MTSS and RTI services. And the real point behind all of this is that we want to be ensuring positive procedures, proactive procedures, kind of getting away from our purely reactive and punitive models of behavior discipline or behavior management, and that we're really relying on the evidence base and the research base to guide what are effective procedures at each tier. So if I'm using those terms at different points throughout this, I'll probably refer to MTSS largely, but know that they're all kind of similar terms for similar concepts. So as we're thinking about tiers of behavioral support, the real purpose behind this is that we want to be thinking about how do we tailor the intensity of the services that we're providing to the intensity of the need of the students. And so many of you have seen this triangle before with the green, the yellow, and the red. And really what this is trying to indicate is that we're trying to create efficient and effective systems where we're trying to capture the majority of our students behaving effectively, following exactly the expectations and the directions that we want them to be following with what we're doing at a school-wide level. So we're not having to individualize, we're not having to intensify for somewhere between 80 to 90%. So that's the bottom of this triangle, that's tier 1. At tier 2, the goal would be that somewhere between 10 to 15% of our students, if our systems are functioning effectively, 10 to 15% of our students may need a little something more, so something a little bit more targeted to their individual needs, and that is tier 2 services, leaving only about 2 to 5% of our students who need really intensive individualized interventions that are often much more multifaceted or involve many more adults in trying to provide the supports that are needed for those students. So the way that we like to look at it at Safe and Civil Schools, even though we have the triangle facing this way, we actually oftentimes in trying to conceptualize this will turn the triangle over. And so what we do is we basically try and think of it as a filtering system. At the earliest stages with tier 1, can we catch the vast majority of our kids with effective school-wide and classroom-based systems that are sort of what is done with everyone and ensuring that the vast majority of our kids really are responding positively to that. At tier 2, then can we capture the large percentage of the remaining students? So if we had about 80 to 90% of our kids responding at tier 1, are we getting a larger capture of students with targeted interventions? So we're doing something a little bit more intensive, but not so much that it is directly individualized and really intensive and complex interventions. And what that's going to do is it's going to leave that 2 to 5% of kids, only a handful of students who are requiring highly individualized and more complex intervention plans. And the second question really being, are all students receiving the services and supports that they need in order to be successful in our school system, with the goal that we don't have any students falling through our cracks. So at any of these different tiers, that no student is falling to the bottom of this filter and sort of falling through, eventually dropping out, failing courses, et cetera. Randy Sprick is my father, those of you who are familiar with Randy, and he always uses this statement with positive behavioral support as well as multi-tiered systems of support that really the notion behind this is that we're trying the easiest, cheapest thing first and hoping that we get lucky. So at tier 1, we're trying promising practices and promising procedures that are supported by the evidence base that say these are going to help the majority of the students do the right thing. Then what are we doing at tiers 2 and tier 3 that provide increasing intensity of service depending on the student's response or non-response to the interventions that happened at earlier tiers? All right, so in order to make this multi-tiered system kind of real for us, I'm going to describe to you 3 different students. And as I do this, I'd just like you to reflect on, do we have students currently in our school system who kind of look and sound similar to the ones that I'm describing? And what services have we provided to them, or where are we thinking that they fall within our multi-tiered system? So let me start with Jacob. Jacob was a real student. He was described by his teacher as one of the most disrespectful students she'd ever worked with. He had a very troubled home life and past. He'd stolen money off of the teacher's desk, wrote crude writing on the bathroom door, and she described this kind of intensification and continuation of escalation that during times of problematic behavior, he would really start to talk back, and then we would see this progressive cycle of escalation. His teacher actually described him as the king of backtalk, and so that was one of her biggest concerns, was that even with minor corrections, that he would start to backtalk and then we would enter this cycle of escalation. Now, moving on to Christopher. Christopher arrived in the middle of the year to the school that he was at, and the teacher who he had had previously actually called the new school and said he's behind academically, he rarely completes his work, he's very hard on the other kids. She described that he trips them, pushes them, hits them. She also indicated that phone calls home and visits to the principal seemed to be completely ineffective. And in the first few days that Christopher arrived at his new school, they noticed that he's pushing other kids down, he's pulling chairs out from under them, he's taking things by them from force, and when he's punished for this hurtful behavior of others, he escalates his misbehavior towards the teacher and peers. And by the third day that he was in his new school, parents of the other students were starting to call and complain about his behavior. So his school system knew we have to intervene fairly quickly to try and get a handle on this. And lastly, Dante had a very troubled home life. Mom was in prison for drug abuse. Dad had lots of anger issues and was either sort of alternating between taking them out on the school and taking them out on Dante. And when the student was coming home from a bad experience at home, so he'd argued with Dad or there was some problem at home, he really struggled to manage conflict at school. So if adults were correcting him for minor misbehavior, he would lash back. This would escalate into swearing and yelling. Sometimes he would storm out of class when he was in these sort of escalated times. And if a peer made a joke that he thought was at his expense, or if he was jostled by a peer, he always had a tendency to perceive those as really hostile interactions, even if the peer was indicating, you know, I just accidentally bumped into you. So during these times, he would begin yelling, and sometimes this escalated into physical fighting. With Dante, in his school, they were using out-of-school suspension fairly frequently, so when these incidents were happening, his dad couldn't take off work. Dante went home unsupervised and he was playing video games all day. And what really ended up happening is Dante's father would come home and be so angry at the school that he would start telling Dante he's doing the right thing, you know, just fight back. And really it was almost this bonding between Dante and his father over their mutual upset with the school system. So as we're exploring our multi-tiered systems, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep coming back to these three students and examining how each of them is responding to different stages of intervention and this sort of intensification of services depending on how they respond. All right, so just to start us out, I know the focus of today is on Tier 2 and Tier 3, but I do want to spend a short amount of time talking about the importance of Tier 1 just to ensure that we're really utilizing our resources wisely and effectively. So with Tier 1, we're talking about school-wide as well as general classroom-level supports that are in place for all students. And what we want to be looking at with these Tier 1 procedures is how to be looking at continuous improvement and looking at the data in our school system to say where are areas of strength that we want to preserve with our climate, our safety, the motivation of students, but also where are areas of concern and need. So we may be examining things like our common areas in our school-wide policies. What particular areas in our school do students feel the most safe and the most respected by peers and adults as compared to areas where maybe they feel less safe and less supported? And are there particular procedures we can revise in terms of how we teach students or how we interact with students, as well as how we structure the setting and the supervision in that setting to try and reduce behavior management concerns. It also includes things like, are we consciously constructing and continuously working to create an invitational climate for all students who walk through our doors, for all parents, all visitors? Do we have consistent staff responses to misbehavior? And then we start looking at things like addressing safety, conflict, and bullying, and do we have really clear procedures and protocols for prevention and intervention with each of those things? And as we move into the classroom, really just the sort of basic classroom management procedures that teachers are structuring the classroom effectively for learning, that we're using time efficiently and making sure that we're teaching expectations, and then early stage interventions. So as we're thinking about this, we want to be really thinking, you know, are we doing enough at Tier 1 to ensure that our Tier 2 and Tier 3 support services are not completely overwhelmed? So if this is something that you're thinking, you know, as you're reflecting on this and you're thinking, wow, we really have a lot of students who maybe should be at Tier 1 but are not, and so we need to do some efforts there. We do have lots of school-wide resources, and there's lots of things out there, but some of the ones through Safe and Civil Schools, we have Foundations, which is our model of PBIS, and what you can see here is these are the resources that we have available through Pacific Northwest Publishing. There's 6 modules of DVD or video streaming content, as well as books to go along with it that guide a PBIS team or Foundations team in trying to implement this work. Foundations is also where we've previously, or we currently do a cohort training model with lots of districts across the country, where we will work with small groups from each school, sort of leadership teams, to try and guide this school-wide implementation of Foundations. At the classroom level, some of the resources that we have available are CHAMPS and Discipline in the secondary classroom. CHAMPS being our grades 1 through 8, and Discipline in the secondary classroom being parallel content to CHAMPS, but geared towards high school. And this is just basic classroom management procedures. And so we do training on these materials as well as have the book content. And as we start moving into early stage interventions, the notion behind early stage interventions is that we hope that all teachers are empowered with some problem-solving processes that they can use with individual students before they would get to the point of needing to have intervention from an outside interventionist or multidisciplinary team. So Teacher's Encyclopedia is just a sort of easy, you pick it up, there's 100 problems listed in the table of contents and 500 intervention plans. So somewhere between 3 to 5 intervention plans for each of the problems listed in that book. It's just a really nice pick-up resource for teachers to be able to kind of flip to, here's the problem that I'm having, here's some potential plans. And then interventions has 6 interventions at the beginning of the book. The later interventions are more Tier 2 and Tier 3, but the first 6 interventions are called early stage interventions that we actually recommend every classroom teacher is empowered with these strategies in this toolkit to be able to try before requiring outside intervention. So just to give you a sense of what those are, we basically recommend with the early stage interventions that these are protocols that are going to help your teachers all become active problem solvers. And the idea that, you know, we could even have teacher-led problem-solving processes where groups of teachers are working together to say, here's the student that I have, here's the problems that I'm seeing, and which interventions can we put in place at the classroom level to try and prevent the need for Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention. So you can see here that there's 6 interventions listed: planned discussion, academic assessment and assistance, goal setting, and so on. And basically that the teacher could work through these 6 interventions to try and see if it's a problem that can be addressed within the classroom setting. All right, so let's take a look now at Jacob. And with Jacob's case, this was the student who was the king of backtalk, the student that when he was corrected for something, he starts arguing back, and we have this increasing intensification of the backtalk that's going back and forth. And we ended up being contacted by a teacher who was just absolutely shocked that when she tried the first intervention in the intervention book, which is called Planned Discussion, and paired it with a little bit of data collection, that this student who she viewed as the most difficult student she had ever worked with in a long-term career in teaching, that this really intensive problem was solved with this seemingly easy intervention. So I'm just going to read through what she did. She held a planned discussion, and before she met with the student, she identified her main concerns and really decided that the backtalk was the thing that really needed to be tackled first. So she decided to make an appointment with him and held the discussion at a neutral time. I think it was like on a Thursday. And during this meeting, they brainstormed actions that each of them could do to resolve the concern. And one of the things that they decided was that they were going to keep a record of how often backtalk was happening, because Jacob kind of indicated that he wasn't aware of how much of a problem this was. At a one-week follow-up meeting, the teacher was able to share the following data with Jacob. And so this is what her behavior chart looked like. On Friday, there were 18 incidents of backtalk. On On Monday, there were 15. On Tuesday, there were 8, Wednesday, 2, and Thursday, 1. She said this worked so well that on Wednesday and Thursday, he'd even stop himself while back talking and apologize. What a difference a week can make. It was so easy. The first 2 days were tough, but he knows the reason I'm doing this is because I care. The report has even improved. He cheated on an assignment and just confessed. All I can say is wow and thank you. Who would think something so easy in elementary would work so well with this kind of student? So in this case, what we're seeing is that a student that we may have assumed was really more of a Tier 3 type of student in terms of the services that they might need, when this teacher tried a Tier 1 early stage intervention, Tier 1 again being it's handled in the classroom, and even though it's a little bit individualized, it's the teacher taking control of the situation and implementing a relatively easy intervention. Our first student, Jacob, really was actually able to be captured within our Tier 1 support systems. Now, we tried similar things with Christopher and Dante. Remember, Christopher was the student that moved in from another school and was exhibiting fairly physically aggressive behaviors, and then Dante, the student who had a troubled home life and was escalating with peers and adults. We tried some Tier 1 procedures, and both of these students didn't have as positive a response, so those are students that we now filter into this Tier 2. Now, let's talk about generally what does Tier 2 look like. And even though this webinar is not going to focus as much on identification procedures, I want to just touch on this, and then again, we'll follow up in more depth in the spring webinar that's focused more on procedural aspects of this. So basically what we're looking at with Tier 2 is students who haven't responded at Tier 1, and we're using data to identify them. So we may be using some behavioral screening measures. I will be talking in the subsequent webinar about things like systematic screening for behavior disorders and using universal screening procedures, as well as red flags. And the red flags that we identified, there's 6 of them, are if a student has failing grades in any of their subjects, if they are chronically absent, and chronic absence is defined as missing 10% or more of the school year, but it's a combination of excused, unexcused, and suspension, so that we're not just looking at truancy or unexcused absence if the kid is missing 10% or more for any reason. If the student is 1 or more grade levels behind peers, if the student has 3 or more office disciplinary referrals in a semester, or 6 or more detentions. And along with detentions, I would also include being sent to a partner classroom or a buddy classroom. So for those schools where we have procedures where the student can be sent from one teacher to another teacher, and the student is basically taking an extended timeout in the other teacher's classroom, we highly, highly recommend that you keep data on how frequently that's used. So how often is the student sent to this other classroom? How long are they sent for? Just so that we make sure it doesn't become a sort of untracked level of the student being outside of the classroom environment, and that really you treat this the same way, so that if the student is being assigned detention or being sent out of the class 6 or more times in a semester, that is then triggering we need some additional intervention supports. And it may also come from student, parent, or teacher requests. So we'll also talk in the subsequent webinar about how these different personnel can make requests for additional services. All right, so then at Tier 2, the first thing that we want to do for any student who is assigned for Tier 2 intervention service is assign them an advocate. And the reason that I have advocate in quotes is that I know that that has some negative connotations in some school systems, where maybe that's looked at as like a special education advocate who is looking at things more from a legal perspective. If that's not the case in your school system, if there's no sort of negative connotations to this, basically this role is a school-based personnel whose job is to monitor the student and make sure that the school is doing everything possible to meet the student's needs. So it's basically somebody who is going to kind of advocate on behalf of the student that they may need some additional supports and services, and ensuring that those procedures are put in place. If the term advocate is problematic in your school system, you could also call this like a school-based mentor, an intervention coordinator, or maybe a Tier 2 support person. And so this person's job is to provide some preliminary investigation of the problem, maybe interviewing the teacher, finding out more about what's actually happening, and then starting to link the student to existing supports and resources. This may be targeted interventions, but basically that anyone who is serving in the role of an advocate should have an awareness of what are the supports that we have available in our school system, as well as being able to provide information to parents about outside services that might be relevant. And so possible advocates within your school system are folks like administrator, dean, nurse, any of your interventionists, your social workers, school psychologists, counselors, et cetera, and that you have lots of personnel that could take on a student or two in order to increase the number of kids that we can serve. All right, so what are we then doing? So we've now assigned the student to an advocate, and now the advocate is trying to say, where should we plug this student in to try and provide them some additional support? And with Tier 2, what we identify at Safe and Civil Schools as sort of the hallmarks of targeted interventions or Tier 2 interventions are these three pieces. The first is that the interventions are what we call ready to use. I've also heard people say something like plug and play, and basically the notion that we have some interventions in our schools that are already designed. There may be a protocol or a manual for how you implement these interventions, and that the student could be plugged into these supports fairly quickly, somewhere between, we identify that the student has a need, and within 3 to 5 days, we can initiate them being put into these support systems. Now, the biggest distinction between Tier 2 and Tier 3 in my mind is that at Tier 2, we're thinking about function. We're thinking, what is the purpose of the student's behavior? So if we know that the student is trying to seek adult attention based on that behavior, we're going to try and incorporate that into whatever intervention we're selecting. So maybe we do have a mentorship type of program that is already up and running in our school system, and if I know that the student is seeking adult attention, then I would plug them into that intervention because mentorship has a strong adult attention component. And so I'm considering function and I'm incorporating it where I can, but the biggest distinction with Tier 3 is that our Tier 3 interventions really are hyper-focused on function. It's ensuring we're thinking through the multiple different factors that could be contributing to the cause of the behavior, and we're really trying to design an individualized intervention that targets that cause. So Tier 2, we're thinking about it, but it's not quite as systematic. And we're plugging the student into 1, maybe 2 or 3 manageable interventions, but we are still at this stage trying to preserve our really intensive intervention resources for kids that have a more resistant problem. All right, so let's take a look at some examples of some targeted interventions. So the first one here is special attention for targeted students. And this is something that we've heard lots of success from both elementary as well as secondary schools when they're identifying that there are students who are somewhat disconnected from the school system, that maybe feel like they're not noticed, and who are seeking attention through misbehavior. So the way that this works is that you would basically show your whole staff a picture of the student that we've selected for this targeted intervention, tell them about some of their interests, and the goal is that all staff members who see this student are going to greet the student by name, talk to them about their interests if they have time, praise the student if they see them doing something well. And so this is really seeking to fill student needs for attention, acknowledgement, belonging, maybe if we have some students who have additional need of nurturing from adults in the building, and then also in terms of trying to increase their sense of competency and effectiveness within the school system, that we're noticing and acknowledging the things that they're doing well. Connections is basically Safe and Civil Schools' model of check-in, check-out, or check-in connect. So it involves the use of a mentor that the student is meeting with on a daily basis, usually in the morning. They're sort of setting goals for the upcoming day. And then throughout the day, the student is carrying a daily report card with them and getting some ratings on their behavioral goals. At the end of the day or the subsequent morning, they're talking with their mentor about those goals and kind of doing ongoing data collection and goal setting. I will be raffling at the end of this session a one-year subscription to the Connections online site, because one of the distinctions that we have with our model of check and check out or check and connect is that we do have an online web-based system that allows you to do automatic data entry, so that you don't have to be, uploading the data to an Excel spreadsheet or something like that. You basically scan the cards into a sheet feeder scanner, and all of your data will automatically be uploaded. So we'll be raffling that as a one 12-month subscription for a whole school site. You can use it with as many students as you want. Another Tier 2 intervention that we can put in place that's got a really strong support in the research literature is meaningful work. And this is a school-based jobs program. We all know the power of giving students little jobs in the classroom, like passing out handouts and things like that. And some of our students who don't shine in any other way sort of show their strengths when we give them those jobs. So meaningful work just basically becomes a more formalized system of creating jobs within your school. You may even do things like having a job posting board where students can apply for jobs, or teachers can make recommendations for different jobs that students can do. And with this, the purpose is to increase students' feelings of being useful and contributing to the school environment. And you can also use it to really be designed to create movement for students who get kind of antsy throughout the school day, or if we are wanting to increase positive interactions with staff members, we could be designing a job that allows the student to interact with lots of different adults throughout the school day and get positive feedback. So one example that we have is, a job where the student goes and collects coffee cups in the afternoon from all of the teachers around the building. So they push a cart around and they gather those coffee cups because it allows them to get some movement and to be interacting positively with lots of adults throughout the school environment. Leadership class is a middle school or high school intervention that could be a 4-credit elective. And what you're doing with this is, rather than the typical leadership model where it's the students who exhibit really strong leadership skills, this would basically be teachers nominating students who have leadership potential but aren't currently living up to it. So maybe some of your more shy and reserved students who have some great skills but are reluctant to sort of step up or say something in class, or students who have that strong personality where they can really guide and lead others, but it's maybe used for ill, not for good at times. These might be appropriate students for that leadership class. And during that time, you would be providing some direct instruction on communication and leadership skills, confidence building activities and confidence boosting, but then also having this leadership group complete some sort of service project or do things like planning a school dance. And so the message being to the students, you really have great potential to be a leader, and we want to develop that through this class. Structured lunch and recess would be for a student who's struggling in those oftentimes unstructured environments. We saw one example of a school that did this where they had their PE teacher and several classified staff who were leading structured recess activities, or you could do this with having structured tables in the lunchroom, each with an adult that is running the activity. And students who are identified as needing this additional support are required to pick one of the activities each time that they're in there. So they might be able to select from 2 different lunch tables that are supervised by an adult, somebody positive who's interacting positively with the students, but also providing that additional supervision. Out at recess, maybe there's 2 or 3 structured games, and the student selects which one that they're going to participate in. Just provide some additional supervision and monitoring and sort of a gradual release of responsibility where we could gradually have them stepping out into less structured and supervised activities. And then targeted interventions, a lot of folks sort of immediately go to thinking about small group interventions like social skills or problem-solving skills, and these are also things that we can build into our Tier 2 systems. The one caution that I have with small group interventions is if you're unfamiliar with the peer deviancy research, the easiest place to start with is there were a group of researchers out of the University of Oregon, I believe, and the primary name is DISHION. I believe it was 1999. There's an article called When Interventions Harm. And the caution that we have to have with small group interventions is that there is this research that indicates for students that are ages 10 and above, they are so maintained by peer attention. They're so reinforced by the attention that they get from their peers that if we lump all of the students who have particular types of misbehaviors together, things like delinquent activity, things like bullying, things like maybe defiant behavior in the classroom, that they are so reinforced by little things that may be occurring from their peers, like somebody rolling their eyes or somebody kind of laughing under their breath, that becomes much more reinforcing than anything that we're trying to provide through the intervention. And so the risk is that when we have students who are ages 10 up through high school, that when we pull them into a small group where it's all peers who have similar types of problematic behaviors, that we may actually be creating more problems than we're solving. And so I heard one example of a school that was telling me they had done something like this where they were trying to pull all of the students to provide like problem-solving training, and it actually ended up creating a new gang in the school because they had basically given the students a peer group that they related to. So if we are using small group interventions with students ages 10 and up, what we need to do to ensure that this is not becoming a problem, that we're actually solving some problems rather than creating them, is to ensure that we have an equal or greater number of peer role models who are included in the group. So if we have 4 students who have a particular social skills problem, that we're including 4 or 5 students who don't have that problem, and hopefully that those other students kind of look up to or relate well with these positive peer role models. All right, so what we can do at Tier 2 is start to create a menu of these targeted interventions. So remember the idea of these being sort of ready-made or plug-and-play types of interventions, that we just have a list of different types of interventions that we are manualizing and we're putting into our systems that we could plug a student into fairly easily at any time. As we're creating this menu, I would encourage you to sort of think about what types of interventions do we have and what needs do they serve. So in a lot of school systems, when I go and I look at their targeted lists of interventions, they focus entirely on students with externalizing types of issues. So students that are acting out in class, exhibiting lots of disruptive and defiant types of behaviors, maybe having lots of peer conflict. And that we have lots of supports and systems designed to help students with externalizing issues in our school system and make sure that we're identifying and meeting their needs. But that many times we've kind of neglected to think about students who have internalizing issues. So if a student has anxiety issues, has depression, maybe is just struggling with motivation or participation in our classes, do we have Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions that are going to help students meet their needs if they're more inwardly directed? We also want to think about different functions of behavior. So are our interventions considering things like students who are doing this to get peer or adult attention, as compared to students who are exhibiting certain behaviors because they're trying to escape an academic deficit or a social skills deficit, as compared to a student who has something maybe even outside of the school system that's a competing reinforcer. So we can be thinking about kind of all of these factors as we're designing that menu. Okay, just to give you an idea of some of what we have available through Safe and Civil Schools and Pacific Northwest Publishing, and part of the reason that I want to preview this is that these are all components that we can build into a Tier 2 or 3 cohort training package. So at the end of the webinar, when I describe that, if that's of interest to you, these are some of the types of interventions that we can put in place. I described meaningful work to you, so we do have a book that describes this and provides lots of information about how to formalize this intervention in your school and have lots of different jobs and job training for supervisors and so on. We have Smart Kids, which is a pre-K through 2. It's a teaching intervention, kindergarten through 1st grade. And the subtitle on Smart Kids is Social Grace, Manners, and Respectful Talk. And it could be a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 type of service. And so what it is it's 18 sets of 5-day lesson plans, which are each about 15 minutes. And it goes into things like giving compliments, saying please, saying thank you. So sort of those preliminary skills that we want our young students to learn. First Step Next was developed by Hill Walker and some colleagues, and it's a pre-K through 2 intervention and tries to teach students skills like following directions, be safe, asking for attention the right way, being a team player, and so on. Tough Kid on Task in a Box, this third one over here, is for grades 1 through 6, and it can be used with individual students, buddy systems, or a whole class, and it's designed to try and improve on-task behavior. The researchers who did this work, and this does come directly from Bill Jensen, who's one of the author of the Tough Kid materials, they found that students in this intervention improved from an average of 32% on-task behavior to 88% on task. And the last one, which I believe we just had a webinar on, is ADAPT, Advancing Decision-Making and Problem-Solving for Teens. It's a small group, middle school and high school intervention for students who are at risk of substance abuse, aggression, truancy, poor school performance, and depressive moods. So it teaches things like problem-solving, refusing drugs, effective communication, and anger management skills. So again, thinking, you know, what range of different types of interventions do we have that we can sort of have ready to go, that we've got some personnel trained on, and we can plug students into them as needed. Now, let's look at Christopher's case. So Christopher, again, was the student who came in from another school and exhibited lots of acting out behavior right from the start. By day 3, parents were calling in to complain about this new student in their child's class. So basically, the team that started working on Christopher's case identified 3 main goals for him: respecting others' rights to safety, staying on task, and following directions. And they really identified that Christopher's behaviors were coming from a high need for attention and recognition, and that had to be built into his plan. So the one time that he was behaving was when the teacher was asking him to do jobs like passing out papers, taking attendance, and so on. So they wanted a job that had high visibility and lots of opportunity for positive interactions with adults. What they ended up doing is they gave him a meaningful work job, and they decided to do the job of lunch ticket distributor. So he went to personnel at the beginning of the day and got lunch tickets, and then went to each of the classrooms to distribute the tickets. So he has an initial positive contact with the office personnel who he's picking these tickets up from, and then through his visits to each different classroom, he's sort of filling his bucket of positive attention from lots of different adults. Initially, his job supervisor was the principal in the school, so she provided him some training on expectations. You know, how do you enter a classroom quietly? What does your behavior look and sound like when you're in the hallway? She made rounds with him so that she could give him immediate feedback and be monitoring his behavior initially. And then after he was trained and seemed to be doing well, he started with a check-in with the principal, made his rounds, and then checked out with the principal. And staff members throughout the school knew that if there were any problems, they could let the principal know, and then we would provide increased supervision and additional job training. But he did so well with this, over time the principal was continuing her role as mentor, but they were able to fade a lot of the more structured levels of support with this. So what we can see with Christopher is that, you know, this tier 2 level of intervention, even though he was entering with really significant levels of misbehavior, this was enough to help him get on track, because he really was, his bucket was getting filled up with the need that he had for attention. Dante, on the other hand, the student on the right side here, we tried some interventions like Connection, so getting him with a supportive mentor, trying to have increased monitoring throughout his day, and really trying to create a support structure and increased monitoring for him. It helped somewhat, but he was still reacting really angrily and displaying a lack of self-control when corrected by teachers or whenever peers were engaging in behavior that he was perceiving as hostile. So what we realized is that we needed to move him into much more intensive intervention and planning procedures that were moving much more into tier 3 and thinking about what skills do we need to teach him in order for him to be successful. So now let's move into thinking about tier 3 procedures. So to identify these students, again, when we think about that filter, if we've tried tier 1 procedures, that didn't work. Now we've filtered the student into tier 2. We've tried some things and that didn't work. So again, Connections did not work as well as we would hope with Dante. Now we're at Tier 3. We can also use data, so again, the screening and the red flags to identify kids that are going to need this level of support. And one other thing to think about is that if we do have a student with really serious issues, so highly physically dangerous behaviors, you know, engaging in lots of fights or, you know, really seriously aggressive behaviors, or if we're seeing significantly odd or frightening types of behaviors that might indicate a mental health type of situation, or if we're seeing lots of threatening types of behaviors, we might move a student automatically into Tier 3. So none of this is saying that we can't bypass some of these earlier stages if the student is really demonstrating a need. But we as much as possible want to preserve Tier 3 resources for kids once we've gone through this filtering system if the behaviors are not so severe at the outset. For Tier 3 planning, now we are at the individualized level. So Tier 1 is school-wide and classroom supports, Tier 2 is targeted types of interventions, and Tier 3 is really individualized, it's specific to the student. What is going to happen at Tier 3 is often much more systematic data collection, and so we're relying on functional behavior assessment and getting some of our personnel in our school who are very well trained in trying to look at behavioral data, look at observations, look at records reviews, maybe interviews, and other sources of data to try and identify the different functions that may be at play and design an effective intervention plan. At this stage, it's often multidisciplinary. So we've got a team of interventionists who are coming together and trying to design a plan for the student, and that now the student is assigned a case manager, so which is similar to an advocate but just has an additional level of responsibility that the case manager is now coordinating the different aspects of what may be designed into this intervention plan. Probably what is the big hallmark of Tier 3, though, is that we're providing increasingly intensive and complex interventions as demonstrated by the need of the student. And so with complex problems, with intensive problems, we need to recognize that the complexity of the intervention is going to be much greater, and it's oftentimes going to be much more multifaceted, where we've got different aspects that we're trying to pull in to meet different functions. And it may also involve additional collaboration with both school personnel as well as outside services, whether that's mental health services, you know, supports for students who are homeless, and so on. So we're getting others involved as needed. Okay. For those of you who are familiar with functional behavior assessment, this is just a real brief review. For those of you who are not, the main idea behind function is that we're looking at the ABCs of behavior. What is triggering the behavior, because those are things that we can start to manipulate, the sort of things that are happening before the behavior happens to try and prevent it, sort of proactive and preventative strategies. We look at specifically what is the behavior, largely so that we can set some goals around those behaviors, and then what is the consequence or what is the student getting out of the misbehavior that is maintaining them doing it across time, because again, functional behavior assessment and function-based intervention planning is assuming that the student is getting something out of this behavior and that's what's maintaining it. So when we go to Dante, when we broke this down, antecedent behavior and consequence for Dante, we noticed that we could predict if he was having a problem at home, we were going to see increased behavioral problems at school. So that was one of the antecedents. And then the two things that were directly triggering his problems in the school setting was when he received corrections from staff and when he was perceiving peer conflict. So whether it was that physical horseplay or somebody jostling him or somebody sort of making fun of him or teasing him, that automatically bumped him into these behaviors of yelling, swearing, leaving class, physically fighting, and that oftentimes was then resulting in increased absences or suspension. Now, the consequences that he was getting is he was getting removed from school and stressful interactions. So when he was fighting, when he was escalating with his teachers, he's getting pulled out either to the office or getting sent home with environments that really were aversive to him, because if we think about being in sort of constant conflict with peers and teachers, school is not going to be a very friendly or fun place. When he was getting sent home, he's not supervised, so he's getting to do something highly reinforcing, playing video and computer games all day. So we had that competing reinforcer. And then probably the most difficult thing was this issue that he had a very fraught relationship with his dad, but when he was suspended from school, when he had these negative interactions with the school system, they were bonding over their mutual dislike of the school and what was going on. And so we needed to build in sort of multifaceted components to build in a plan that was going to address all of these different complex interactions that were leading to pretty intensive behaviors. Our goals for intervention were we needed to provide some supports for Dante in the short term that we're going to reduce his problems in the school setting and his perceptions of it being such an aversive place. So we needed some short-term things that were going to kind of provide some escape from the aversive aspects of things that he struggled with, provide him additional support with peer interactions and adult interactions, but we needed to also be thinking about how are we building some social skills and some coping skills in the long term, because we can't change his home life, and he obviously had some skills deficits that we need to work on. The difficult one, and sometimes what we see with intervention with kids who have really tough parents, is that we couldn't wait for dad to come around. There was such a negative relationship built across years with the school system and his dad that it wasn't like we were going to have an automatic turnaround of that, but that also meant we're going to have to work 10 times harder to not give up on Dante and not say, you know, this is kind of a lost cause because we're fighting against this fraught relationship with his dad. So one of our goals was over time to see if we could work to chip away at improving this relationship. We really tried to front load lots of positive phone calls home and really emphasizing the strengths that Dante was bringing to the school system, and also finding alternatives to out of school suspension so that over time we could reduce his frustration that his student was being sent home all the time and try to make him a partner in the process. So what that looked like, we connected Dante with a strong adult mentor at school, and we tried to find somebody that he really connected with at a personal level and built that really strong relationship with them. That person met with him before school to check in, and this was really designed to interrupt that cycle of when we know he's having a bad day, we're going to have to put some different supports in place to try and make sure that he's going to be okay throughout those tough days. So whenever the interventionist noted that there were some home triggers or that Dante was coming in agitated, they were doing things like offering him some, choice activities at the start of the day, some altered requirements rather than going straight to class that could kind of reset, putting him in a good mood. And then they also did things like sending out a notification to all of his teachers saying, I've noticed that Dante is kind of upset today or kind of agitated, so let's be extra, providing some extra care and support for him. And then we also had some different expectations, like on different academic activities where we knew he really struggled. We gave him some additional options on days that we knew were going to be difficult. So that was the short term. In the long term, we had to think about how do we provide him training in areas of deficit. So he needed coping skills to deal with frustration, both coming from home as well as frustrations at school. He needed direct instruction on how to respond appropriately to corrections and how to reframe negative and self-defeating talk. So when he was, getting bumped by someone, his automatic reaction was that was hostile. We needed to help him start to think about it. Okay, maybe that was accidental. I can just ignore it. So what we had to do is try and see, because this is a lot of skills to teach, do we have existing skill groups that we can put him into where he'll have some positive peer role models, but then also using his mentor to provide one-on-one training with certain specific skills that we didn't have built in other places. We also provided a reinforcement system, so you can see he was earning points for when somebody gave him a correction and he responded appropriately, when he had appropriate peer interactions or was expressing that he was frustrated rather than starting to escalate, and that he was earning some of that video game and computer time that he would have been getting at home. And then to monitor that, basically with all of the data collection, we used the connection system to be able to do that. So, now we're kind of coming to the conclusion. I provided an example of how 3 different students, all of whom had pretty intensive levels of behavior, may have responded to these tiered systems at different levels of intervention and how we sort of filter them through. And just a couple of closing thoughts is that, with our examples, what we can see is that the Tier 3 intervention is really time-consuming, and it has to utilize high levels of expertise from our school psychologists, our social workers, It involves lots of personnel to put the supports in place to meet the students' needs. And so what we need to be continually thinking about and revamping is ways to preserve the expertise of the folks who have this intensive behavioral knowledge with more resistant problems. So kind of protecting the processes and players that are involved. And so whenever we start to see that we're overwhelming higher tiers, the tier 2 and tier 3, with lots of kids who need intervention services, we want to go back to the previous tier, tier 2 or tier 1, to say what can we do with broader groups of students to try and prevent the problem. And so this looks different at different schools. At a school that maybe has very, very low risk factors, has lots of parental support, lots of kids who are sort of their buckets are already filled, we may have a handful of students who need something like a lesson on responding appropriately to corrections. So in that school, in a school system where there's very few kids who are at risk, a lesson like accepting corrections might be done at a targeted small group level or even tier 3. It's just done with an individual student. I'm going to go directly and I'm going to teach that student. Whereas in another school with lots of kids with lots of risk factors, lots of kids who have never learned that rolling your eyes or swearing at somebody is really disrespectful, that might actually be a tier 1 procedure at another school. So again, you're really trying to tailor what are we needing to do at each of these tiers based on the level of intensity of the behaviors that we're seeing from our students. Some of our resources that we have for Tier 3 at Safe and Civil Schools, we have the interventions book, which has 26 highly structured interventions, and then we also have a functional behavior assessment of absenteeism and truancy, as well as bullying. And for general FBA resources, Safe and Civil Schools doesn't have anything formal, although we can provide training in this. And just know that many state departments and many other service providers do have lots of materials and resources that provide information on general FBA procedures. Just to summarize last little bit here, rolling out this cohort training model, what we're trying to do is now be working with student support teams in a model that's very similar to our Foundations Tier 1 type of training. It's basically designed to be 3 to 7 days of training per year across 2 to 3 years, depending on how quickly you're wanting to move forward with this. The general things that we'll be looking into during those lots of days of training are providing really, really systematic training on data collection, analysis, and decision-making. We will also provide full days of training on connections and meaningful work so that those interventions are ready to go and really systematized in your schools. And then providing overviews as well as more depth, if you want to add it in, on any of these other intervention resources like Teacher's Encyclopedia, Tough Kid, On Task in a Box, and some of the social skills curricula that we have. And then for the Tier 3, providing training in the highly structured interventions in the interventions book, as well as functional behavior assessment. All right, so wrapping up here, I am going to have Jackie tell me 2 names for the connections and meaningful work, and then you can see that I've got some resources and follow-up phone numbers as well as websites if you're interested in looking into more on either published resources or training. So Jackie, who are our 2 names?
Just for the Meaningful Workbook, we have Annie Latuca with Galveston Elementary.
Great.
And then for the connections, we have Bill Cassidy with Gardendale City Schools. And I've got their contact information from their initial registrations.
Wonderful. So Annie and Bill, congratulations. Thanks for sticking with us this whole time, and we'll be in touch to get you your resources. Thank you all so much for this, and if this was helpful to you, be looking out for that follow-up in March or April, and we'll be talking a lot more about sort of the processes that fit within everything that we talked about today. Thank you.
Yes, we do have some questions, and so
yes,
for folks that can hang on, we can run through them. Otherwise, they'll be part of the recording that we will post online along with the slides. It takes a day or 2 to get that online. We will send an email out to everybody to let them know when that's available. So just kind of running back, one of the questions, there was a query about what red flags would you be looking for in younger students, i.e. K through 4?
You know, that is a great question, and because my expertise is probably a little bit more geared higher level, I am going to pose that question to some of our other trainers and folks that are really versed in the younger child research, and I'll be getting back to you guys on that.
Okay. We can certainly send that information out outside of the, along with the link information, or I've got the
yes, absolutely.
Follow up with the question asking. We have a couple more questions. One, principals are spending most of their time with 3 to 5 intensive students, violent running, et cetera. What research-based practices support these most intensive students?
This is where, you know, again, going into if you have personnel in your schools who are trained to provide functional behavior assessment, you know, it's difficult to determine what types of interventions would be the most helpful unless you understand what need is the student trying to fill by running or by exhibiting some of these really highly escalated behaviors. A couple of the resources that might be worth looking into, if it's younger students, so kindergarten through 2nd grade or pre-K through grade 2, I highly recommend looking into First Step Next. I know that with that brief description that was given, that is specifically what those materials are geared to, and there's a very strong research base supporting them. Some of the other things you might look into, Jeff Colvin has a book, I believe it's called Managing the Cycle of Emotional Escalation, I think.
Managing the Cycle of Acting Out Behavior.
Yes, thank you, Jackie. Managing the Cycle of Acting Out Behavior in the Classroom. And that's a really good starting place just to start thinking about what kind of predictors can we start noticing in the student's behavior as we start to notice them kind of ramping up in that cycle, that we're seeing sort of predictable things typically from students, and that we can put different interventions in place for that student depending on where they are in that cycle of escalation. So that's definitely been one of my go-to resources as I'm problem solving.
I have another question about a school that has a universal behavior screener in their district. What is the best use of that data?
Great question. Without knowing the screener, I know that the one that we use is called systematic screening for behavior disorders. It's oftentimes kind of considered the gold standard of universal screening. With SSBD, I know it's designed to really identify students that are very much at tier 3, both for externalizing and internalizing. But that basically what we recommend with that is if you have the data for students that are at slightly lower tiers, so maybe they're not identified by the screening procedures as highly at risk, but we've still got some data for them, that if you're identifying through other red flags, so let's say the student reaches, 3 behavioral referrals or something like that, that we could then be using some of the screening data to say, where do we want to start at looking at intervention, or where do we want to start looking, the teacher indicated that there's these problematic factors, so that's where we're going to start doing some additional data collection.
Terrific. There was an article that you referred to about interventions.
Yes.
Looking for the name of that article.
Yes. It's called When Interventions Harm. It was 1999, and the primary researcher on it was, I believe you pronounce it Dishon, D-I-S-H-I-O-N. And that was basically a synthesis of multiple different studies indicating that we could be creating more behavioral issues than solving if we're grouping all of the students with deviant behaviors together.
Terrific. And then just a housekeeping question, and I think we answered this before, but we'll bring it up again. We will make the PowerPoint slides and the recorded webinar available on our website in just a couple days. We don't have a formal certificate for participation, but you can send us an email, and we can send you an email that says that you did participate in the webinar for folks who need that. We don't have a formal credit or continuing education unit type of program in place for this, though. And I think, Jeff, that is everything that we have.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you, Jackie, for the support.
No problem. Have a great day, everyone. We appreciate you joining us.